Hello and welcome to another episode of The Facts. I'm your host, Brianna Sagdahl, and this week we talk climate change with the Doctor of Metallurgical Engineering, Gary Schuster. Gary, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Facts.
Thanks for having me, Brianna.
First, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
I was born in St. Louis. Both my parents were born and raised in St. Louis. My father served in World War II, came back and got a degree in electrical engineering from using the GI Bill, worked as an electrical engineer for a time, always had this lifelong ambition to be a farmer. That's made him pretty unusual, needless to say, but he moved the family to a farm in Iowa. I was 3 at the time. So I was raised on a family farm in Iowa. When I graduated from high school, enrolled at Iowa State University, got a bachelor's degree in physics at Iowa State. When finished with that, I immediately enrolled at the University of Illinois, got a PhD in metallurgical engineering from the University of Illinois. From Illinois, I started my professional career, worked as an engineer, scientist, and a technical manager. So 35 years doing that, and now, of course, I'm retired. So some credentials there, including actually when I was working professionally, I picked up an MBA. One thing you didn't hear was any experience or training, formal training in climate science. I don't have any degree or formal training in climate science, so I should explain what it is that makes me qualified to do this talk.
Well, thank you. I was just going to ask.
The reason, my focus is that there's a climate change narrative, that, and I'll explain what that is, but the assertion of the supporters of the climate change narrative is that it's what they're saying is true because it's settled science. So,
but Gary, is science ever really settled?
well, there's all kinds of things wrong with that assertion, and you've hit on one of them. But the focus of my talk is going to be why that statement is clearly not true. And when you take that away from their narrative, from their defensive narrative, then there's pretty much nothing left. So my focus is on science, and so I don't have a climate science background, but my academic training is science, and I've done a lot of reading on science since graduating from school. So I do fundamentally understand what science is, and I'm going to explain why this assertion is clearly false.
Absolutely, and there's something called a golden standard, if you will, right? There's the scientific method, is that right?
Scientific method is a very important part of science, and I'm actually going to go into some detail as to what that is. And after I explain that, it will be pretty easy for your listeners to understand why it's just not true, that what they say.
Okay. So do you want to first start by telling us what is the climate change narrative?
Yes, that's clearly a pretty important part in this conversation. There's 3 assertions with the climate change narrative, and all 3 have to be true for the narrative itself to be true. The 3 assertions are: first, that the climate is currently changing; second, that this climate change is being driven by greenhouse gas emissions from human activity; and third, that the climate change is going to result in an existential threat to humanity. So a threat to our very existence. So all 3 of those things have to be true for the narrative to have any substance. So just start with the third one, that it presents an existential threat. If it doesn't present an existential threat, then why worry about it? You know, it's as I'm going to explain later, it's a huge cost. So if there's no problem with it, then don't worry about it. And just kind of an aside, without me talking any about the science, everyone should be skeptical of that claim that it's going to be a threat. Just because, again, if you believe the climate change alarmists, there has been a change in global temperatures since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Temperatures are up like a degree and a half or something along those lines. And during that same period from then till now, we've had just tremendous increases in our standard of living or our lifespans. So far, this increase in global temperatures, if indeed it's occurring, has not been a problem. The second one, that greenhouse gas emissions are what's driving this climate change. Again, I'm going to talk about that more with the scientific method aspect of this discussion, but something to consider here is that there's been a number of climate cycles. When I was growing up in Iowa, we were taught in school that Iowa was under a glacier 10,000 years ago. It obviously melted, but the world's been cycling between tundra and tropical rainforest for a long, long time, many times. And the point to that is that up until 300 years ago, man had no influence, that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from human activity was very small, yet you had all these cycles where the climate went from very cold to pretty moderate.
Stick around. This is the fact. Welcome back to The Facts. I'm your host, Brianna Sagdahl. This week, we're addressing climate change with our guest, Gary Schuster. Before we left for the break, Gary was letting us know the three aspects that need to be satisfied in order to satisfy the scientific method. Is that right, for proving climate change as an existential threat?
The question was, what is the climate change narrative? Mm-hmm. So I was explaining the narrative, and then I'm going to the scientific method and explain why it is that the assertion that it's settled science is not true. So I'll just kind of pick up where I think we left off, that one should be skeptical of these three assertions even without knowing the science. And I explained why for the assertion about the existential threat and the greenhouse gas emissions that clearly didn't drive a lot of earlier climate change cycles. And the last one, I'll just mention that the fact, or the assertion that we're currently experiencing climate change. Climate it's not like weather. It takes 30 years of data to establish a climate. So to say, well, gee, every year we've been having record high temperatures and that proves that we're having climate change, it doesn't. You've got to do 30 years of data.
Wait, let me stop you there. So can you explain the difference between weather and climate then? Is there like a definition?
Essentially, climate is average weather. So weather you can change every day. Climate.
For a period of years, decade, you said 38 years.
Well, 30 years. It's generally accepted that it takes 30 years of weather data to establish a climate.
Wow. So I've never heard that before. Thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate that clarity.
It's very important in that if you want to do experiments and you need to collect data points, it takes 30 years of data to get one climate data point. So that's going to be an important point when I get to the scientific method, which I think I'll get to next.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry. I'll
no,
stop
not at all. I did. These are important clarifications. So thank you. But the narrative has those three assertions, and again, how do you know they're true? Well, the narrative supporters say it's settled science. So essentially, we're saying, well, what does that mean? Well, I think the people that support the narrative are suggesting or are saying that all reputable scientists believe this, and if you don't believe it, then you're a climate denier, which means that you're either spreading misinformation or you're not smart enough to understand what they're telling you. None of that's true, but nevertheless, that's what they're trying to convey to people.
Gary, if I may, isn't part of the scientific process asking questions?
Well, absolutely. And another part of it is nothing is known for certain. So to say it's settled is, that's in itself kind of a contradiction to science, because you're always, a theory is never accepted as being absolutely true. It's only accepted until it's disproven, and then something new comes along, and that's historically happened many times.
Well, so then does science prove the climate change narrative?
No, it doesn't. Not at all. Not even close. And I'll get to that right now. Science is a way to learn things about the universe. And how does science do that? Well, it does that by using a process that's aptly named the scientific method. And the scientific method has three steps. Let me just say, I don't want to scare any viewers. Science can be very complicated, just almost counterintuitive. But the scientific method itself is simple to understand. I'm going to explain it. I think most everyone's going to understand. First, that if you're trying to explain a phenomenon, you observe it. You just simply look at it. You take notes, photographs, measurements, do what you can to see what's going on.
Sure.
Second, you develop a theory to explain it, theory or hypothesis. So you've got all these notes and observations, measurements. You've seen something, whatever was going into the process. You've seen what was coming out, and you come up with an explanation as to what's happening. So that's a theory. And the third step, and this is what most scientists think is the most important, is you test your theory. Mm-hmm. So how do you do that? Well, you conduct a controlled experiment. So you've got the phenomenon, you have to control the inputs, you have to be able to measure the outputs, and you do that. You do an experiment where you measure the outputs from known inputs, and then you compare your measurements to what was predicted by your theory. So if the measurements agree with your theory's predictions, then you have a useful theory. It's not necessarily a true theory because you've just tested it a little bit, but what testing you've done shows agreement with your theory. And then you go on. People can take your theory and do the same thing, and if it's used and tested a lot and it always agrees, after a while it becomes a law.
And so when you say always agrees, that means someone else should be able to test your theory, reproduce it, and end up with the same results, essentially, right?
Yes, they should be able to reproduce your results. They should be able to make new results that all agree with the theory.
Interesting.
Yes, so that is the scientific method. And you might say, well, gee, this seems pretty simple, nothing very complicated about it, and that's right. Nevertheless, it's very profound that it was invented by Galileo in the 17th century, and prior to him, scientific progress was very slow. So I think I'll cut it off there for a little bit and get back to you.
Stick around. I'm Brianna. These are the facts. Welcome back. I'm Brianna Sagdahl, and these are the facts. This week, we're discussing the climate change issue with our guest, Gary Schuster. Gary, when we left off, we were right about to discuss if the application of the scientific method has shown us, or what, excuse me, rather, has it shown us about the climate change narrative?
As I mentioned early on, the climate change supporters, narrative supporters have said that the climate change is settled science. And so I've explained what the narrative is, I've explained what science is. So, of course, the obvious answer to your question is that they've used the scientific method and confirmed the climate change narrative. And that is simply untrue. So again, the scientific method, the most important part about that is testing to show that whatever theory you have actually agrees with the observations or the measurements that you make on whatever it is that you're explaining. So in this case, probably the primary example is that for the narrative that greenhouse gas emissions are driving climate change.
Sure, and certainly we hear the most about CO2, for example, here in the United States.
Absolutely, CO2 is probably your most common greenhouse gas. So the obvious thing is that someone tested to show that there's a direct causal effect between climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And no such test has been done. Why do I say this? Well, because two things. One, climate change, you've got to do 30 years of data collection to get one climate data point. So to do a test like what we're describing here, you'd have to do two 30-year data collection periods. One at a certain greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, and then a second 30-year period with a different greenhouse gas concentration. Compare the two climates and see if they differ in the way that your climate theory predicted. So number one, there is no climate theory. There's climate models, and there's lots of models, and the reason being that they keep changing. So that should tell you something about the confidence that people have, since they're having to change quite a bit. But to do a controlled experiment, one would have to control all of the inputs to climate for these two 30-year periods. One, for the greenhouse gas concentration, they'd be able to have them set at different values for the two 30-year periods. And they'd have to hold constant all the other input variables. Otherwise, if they let those vary, then of course any change could be due to the variation in those variables. You just, practically speaking, could never do an experiment like that. And that's not uncommon in science. There are ideas and theories that can't be tested. Of course, if they can't be tested, those theories are given very little heed, because in science you've got to test to be able to say that this is supported by science. So for climate science, for these models, that's not being done. Never has been done, can't be done. So there is none of that third requirement in science testing or in scientific method for this climate change narrative. So when they say it's settled science, I'm not sure what they mean, but it's not that it's been proven by science.
So Gary, if I'm hearing you correctly, we have not been able to establish that climate change is at least a credible threat, yet we're seeing policies that are being implemented at a rapid rate today. And we see a handful of individuals who have a lot of money to gain from this narrative. In your opinion, has any of the data available today, does it justify the policies that we're seeing coming out of our federal government or on the state side? Does it justify this, I think you said $50 trillion new economy that's emerging?
Well, I don't think government policy on this is justified at all. Carl Sagan made a quote that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So in this case, we've got this claim that climate change is coming, and to stop it, we're going to have to do things like eliminate fossil fuels. And as you mentioned, Morgan Stanley says $50 trillion we'll have to spend to stop climate change. And this is going to have a huge impact on people. So whatever that existential threat is that they say climate change presents, think about how much it's going to cost people if they no longer can use fossil fuels and they have to pay for all the actions that are necessary to stop climate change. So that's a huge cost to society, especially if you're in the people that other parts of the world mostly that aren't as affluent as we are, that are going to drop down because their standard of living will decrease without the use of fossil fuels. They'll be really hurting. So there's a price to pay either way, and a threat. And since there isn't scientific evidence to back up this idea that the narrative people are pushing, it's not a risk that is justified. The price is very high. The benefits are not clear.
Or unknown, certainly.
Unknown, yeah.
And Gary, just to touch on that a little bit, we both formerly lived in the state of Oregon, and we just experienced, a massive storm that swept through the United States within the last couple of weeks. And after the state of Oregon recently passed several policies, one of which banned wood stoves, another one they attempted to get rid of gas generators. The state of Oregon had sold multiple plows because they were going to make way for EV plows or some such nonsense, I don't know. But many people were left without power. And the only reason they were able to stay warm was because of gas generators and because they openly defied these new policies. They kept their wood stoves, for example, and they relied on tried and true tested things that would create warmth or generate electricity, for example. And so I think it's a really good example, having just experienced a very cold snap through the entire United States, of the type of sacrifices that our politicians are requesting of the American population for a relative unknown. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. What you mentioned, that's part of the price that we would pay. That renewables, there's good things to say about them, but they are not as dependable as the conventional fuels that we use now. So that's a different topic, but it actually is strongly related in that it's a price that we would pay if we decide to ban fossil fuels.
Thank you so much, Gary. We really appreciate your time. We're so grateful that you came on and shared your knowledge with us this segment. And thank you so much for tuning into The Facts. Make sure to join us next week. I'm your host, Brianna Sadville.